The story unfolded in a city whose reputation was well established, though not for the beauty of its landscapes or the harmony of its inhabitants. It was a city where rain frequently fell, not just to cleanse the streets of their drab, stained routine, but as if attempting to obscure the injustices that permeated every corner. The alleys and boulevards of this city, saturated with the scent of wet asphalt, were steeped in whispers carried by a black population that had lived for generations under the crushing weight of systemic discrimination. Laughter was rare, as though every smile was an act of defiance in a place where freedom was an unattainable luxury for black residents. The city's black citizens were condemned to a form of enforced invisibility. They knew full well that, in this place, the authorities were not there to protect them but to oppress, to uphold an order that favored some while crushing others. The police, ever present, were not merely a force of law but the embodiment of silent yet relentless domination. Their grim faces, hard gazes, and often menacing posture served as constant reminders that black neighborhoods were zones of control, spaces where human dignity seemed to erode at every street corner. Their presence alone sufficed to remind everyone that injustice was woven into the very fabric of the city. Alyssa knew this reality all too intimately. Born and raised in this city, she had witnessed her community suffer repeatedly, bearing the burden of injustice daily. She had seen her friends, family, and neighbors humiliated under the guise of routine checks. Their clothes were rarely stained by accident. More often, they were marked by the shame of public humiliation inflicted on black people in a city where racial profiling was the norm. She had felt the vertigo of fear triggered by every police siren, every engine roar, every shadow of a patrol car stopping in the black streets. Every time the siren wailed, a shiver ran through the skin of the black residents, and the averted gazes in the streets spoke volumes about the lives lived under this relentless pressure. That day, under a sky heavy with threatening clouds, as Alyssa stepped out of a small store, a wave of anxiety washed over her before she even glimpsed the shadow of the police officer. She didn't need to see his face to know what was coming. She knew it was inevitable. In a city like this, a black woman could never truly go unnoticed or even be presumed innocent. Every step she took seemed, in some way, to invite injustice, to invite judgment without cause. The officer who approached her, tall and imposing, wore more than just a uniform. He bore the weight of institutionalized violence and contempt for those he was supposed to serve. His cold, implacable gaze judged Alyssa before a single word was exchanged. The rain pounding against his uniform amplified his image, a figure larger than life, heavier, more threatening, a silhouette whose mere presence was a punishment in itself. This was no routine check. It was a display of power, a silent declaration that he stood above her, that she had no place in this city beyond its invisible boundaries. When he demanded her papers, his booming, authoritative voice seemed to seal Alyssa's fate, leaving no room for negotiation. She froze, feeling the heat of her heart pounding violently in her chest, a drumbeat reverberating through her body as she struggled to stay calm. She knew all too well that one wrong reaction, one misinterpreted gesture, could escalate the situation and lead her into a spiral of unending police violence. Yet when she dared to ask, "Why are you detaining me?" she struck a nerve. In the officer's eyes, Alyssa was no longer a citizen but a threat. A threat simply for daring to question the authority he represented. A threat because she was a black woman in a world conditioned to view her as inferior. Before she could say anything more, the officer violently shoved her against the wall. The cold, rough concrete bit into her skin as the chill seeped through her soaked clothing. Her wrists were brutally seized and cuffed, trapping her in a suffocating silence. The rain continued to pour relentlessly, but it did nothing to slow the unfolding scene. Witnesses, initially hesitant, began to gather, forming a silent but omnipresent crowd. The onlookers' gazes were filled with quiet terror, a terror born of knowing all too well what this meant. What they witnessed was not an isolated incident, but another chapter in a story that repeated endlessly. A story the rain could not wash away, a cycle of suffering and repression without end. Phones were quickly drawn, their screens capturing the scene of systemic violence. To the spectators, Alyssa was no longer just a black woman. She had become a symbol, a face among countless others who embodied the collective pain of an oppressed community. Their eyes scanned her figure, a stark reminder of the omnipresent injustice, the invisible burden carried for far too long. Their phones recorded not just a single event but a tragic act that had become all too familiar. A stark image of a people's struggle against an unjust and unyielding system. Alyssa, still pinned against the wall, felt as though the world was collapsing around her. Her words, filled with sincerity, seemed to vanish into the wind, swallowed by the booming authoritarian voice of the police officer. "Shut up," he barked, leaving no room for discussion. His unyielding gaze remained fixed on his task as he rummaged through her bag with uncontrolled fury, as though searching for a reason, an excuse to justify this humiliating arrest. But what he found in the depths of Alyssa's bag would alter the course of events entirely. As he pulled out Alyssa's FBI badge, the officer froze. A shiver ran through his body, his hands trembling slightly. His face, previously closed off and impassive, shifted into an expression of horror and panic. The relentless rain failed to mask the guilt now etched across his features. He had just realized, too late, that he had made a monumental error. This woman, whom he had presumed to be just another black citizen he could humiliate at will, was nothing less than an FBI agent. Worse still, he had physically assaulted her in front of witnesses who were now capturing everything on their phones. His ears rang under the mounting pressure, the weight of an unforgivable mistake bearing down on him, a mistake that would have consequences he could no longer ignore. The shock he felt was nothing compared to Alyssa's. She had not only been mistreated as a black citizen in this city, she had just been humiliated and assaulted in front of a crowd of individuals who might not yet grasp the full magnitude of what had occurred. But as their eyes met, there was no doubt. Everyone understood. Phones had been pulled out in an instant, videos being recorded and shared at lightning speed. The incident was now spiraling out of control. This was no longer merely an abuse of power. It was a public spectacle, a flagrant affront to the law, unfolding in broad daylight under the watchful eyes of witnesses and the digital lenses that would soon broadcast the event worldwide. The videos spread across social media instantly. Within hours, the incident was everywhere. On news bulletins, in trending hashtags, and in everyday conversations. Alyssa's name, previously unknown to most of the country, became an immediate symbol. Millions of people were shocked and outraged by what had transpired. Media outlets replayed the footage repeatedly, and the officer's face became synonymous with police brutality. What had begun as a blatant act of racism quickly escalated into a national controversy, one that transcended the boundaries of this city. The situation deteriorated further as protests erupted in numerous cities within hours. Hundreds of demonstrators gathered outside the local police precinct, chanting powerful slogans like "Justice for Alyssa" and "Stop Police Brutality." The signs they held aloft with pride and determination reflected the deep societal unrest. Within the protests, faces radiated a collective anger at a system that had allowed such violence to occur unchecked for far too long. The name of Sergeant Davies, now made public, was at the center of widespread criticism. His reckless actions, devoid of consideration for their repercussions, had thrust him into the storm of public shame. Alyssa, still in shock, was taken to the hospital for a thorough medical examination. The pain, both physical and emotional, was slowly sinking into her consciousness. Her FBI colleagues, outraged and devastated, rushed to her side. They were more than co-workers, they were her professional family, and their support was immediate and unwavering. They knew that what Alyssa had endured wasn't just a physical assault, it was an affront to everything they stood for. The FBI, an institution of justice and legality, now faced a scandal that would shake public trust in law enforcement. Under mounting media scrutiny, calls for Sergeant Davies's resignation grew louder. Dozens of public figures, political leaders, and community activists demanded his immediate removal. This was no longer solely about justice for Alyssa, it was a stand against police impunity. The police department's Internal Affairs Bureau launched a comprehensive investigation. The findings emerged swiftly, and what they revealed only fueled public outrage. Davies had a history of complaints for abusive behavior, violent incidents, and mistreatment of civilians, particularly black individuals. This was not an isolated incident. It was a pattern, a culture of violence and contempt that had been ignored for far too long. The revelations spread like wildfire, intensifying public anger and amplifying the protests shaking the streets. Citizens, now acutely aware that police brutality was not just an isolated issue but a systemic problem, rose up en masse. The system was broken, and everyone could see it. Davies's name became a focal point of the movement, a symbol of unchecked police violence. Protests erupted in major cities, demanding not only Davies's resignation but also sweeping reforms within law enforcement to ensure such attacks would never happen again. Despite the physical and emotional pain, Alyssa decided to speak publicly. In a poignant press conference, she shared her story, exposing the reality that many Black people face every day. Her voice, filled with emotion but brimming with dignity, touched many hearts and sparked a national debate on police reform. The trial against Davies received widespread media attention. Alyssa testified with courage, and each hearing brought new revelations and testimonies of support. Families of victims of police violence spoke out, sharing their own stories of suffering and injustice. Ultimately, the pressure from the public paid off. Sergeant Davies was found guilty of misconduct and suspended from his duties. However, the victory of justice did not end the fight. The Alyssa case brought about a collective awakening regarding the necessary reforms in police practices. National discussions began to focus on how to better protect citizens and ensure true accountability for law enforcement. Alyssa, though deeply marked by this traumatic experience, became an iconic figure in the fight against abuses of power. Her decision to speak openly about the injustices she endured, as well as her determination to transform this pain into a call for change, made her a symbol of resilience and courage. As Alyssa's fame grew, she received invitations to conferences and panels across the country. Each speech she gave was an opportunity to raise awareness about the realities faced by marginalized communities. Her interventions, filled with passion and precision, not only described the injustices but also proposed concrete solutions to address them. The movement Alyssa inspired took shape as a non-profit organization dedicated to police reform and civil rights protection. The organization, named Justice for All, focused on police training, transparency in law enforcement practices, and supporting victims of police violence. Working with lawyers, sociologists, and activists, Alyssa established awareness programs in affected communities and advocacy campaigns for stricter laws on police accountability. Her commitment was not limited to the national stage. She began collaborating with international organizations, sharing her experiences and strategies to help combat abuses of power on a global scale. Her travels abroad allowed her to build connections with social justice movements in various countries, strengthening the impact of her message. Alyssa's influence did not go unnoticed in her hometown, which began to see noticeable changes. Law enforcement, under the pressure of reform and the vigilant gaze of the public, started to adopt more transparent practices. Police officers were now required to undergo training on de-escalation and respecting civil rights. Complaint oversight mechanisms were strengthened, and independent commissions were established to investigate alleged abuses. Although the road was still full of obstacles and challenges remained, Alyssa saw tangible signs of progress. The neighborhoods that had once been oppressed began to regain a semblance of trust in justice. The youth, who once feared interactions with the police, began to believe in the possibility of change. In her personal life, Alyssa found a fragile balance between her hard work and her private life. She surrounded herself with a strong support team, including her family, close friends, and dedicated colleagues. Despite the growing recognition and visible changes, she remained true to her principles, always striving to improve the living conditions of the people she represented. Alyssa's story is that of a woman who, through pain and adversity, transformed her experience into a force for the greater good. Her name, now synonymous with courage and justice, inspired a new generation to continue the fight for a more equitable and humane world. As we close this story, let us remember that the pursuit of justice is an ongoing journey. Alyssa's legacy encourages us to stay vigilant, to stand up for the oppressed, and to believe in our collective ability to create a fairer world.